Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We are beginning chapter 12, which is entitled Disposable Ties. We are on page 158 for anybody who may be following along. It was the day before Arlene had to be out, and she still hadn't received her welfare check. The family's caseworker at Wraparound had given the boys Christmas gifts. Arlene and their fathers did not. The boys didn't receive anything from their uncles or aunties either, not that they expected to. Arlene's 3 brothers and 1 sister had their own kids to worry about. One brother received SSI, another sold drugs and helped landlords repair properties. The other was out of work. Arlene's sister was trying to raise 3 kids on what she made as a school bus monitor. Aunt Merva had money. She had held down steady jobs for as long as Arlene could remember and would bring her and her siblings food and gifts when they were children. Quote, "We wouldn't ever see it," end quote, Arlene recalled. Her mother and stepfather got first pickings. But Arlene was not going to call her Aunt Merva for something as frivolous as Christmas gifts or even rent. Over the years, she had learned to ask her favorite aunt for help only during true emergencies, and evictions didn't qualify. If Arlene asked too often or for too much, she would, quote, hear about it, end quote. Merva might give her a lecture or, worse, stop returning her calls. Sharina assumed Arlene had, quote, some sort of family to stay with, end quote. But none of Arlene's family members had gone to court with her. None had offered to help her make rent. None had opened their homes to her and her boys. None had offered to help her find another place to live. Quote, "They just funny like that," end quote, Arlene said. Quote, "My family don't help. I don't have no one to help me. I searched around until I find somebody who will," end quote. When Arlene answered the door, she found Sharina standing on her porch with a woman in a tan winter coat. Sharina, who had a habit of showing apartments before tenants had moved out, asked to come in. She walked the prospective tenant through the apartment, stepping over Arlene's things. When the tour was over, Sharina explained that Arlene had been evicted and would be gone by the next day. The young woman asked where Arlene would go, and Arlene said she didn't know. The young woman took another look around, eyeing the tops of the walls as if judging the soundness of the foundation. She told Sharina she'd take it. Then she looked at Arlene and told her that she and her boys could stay until they found a place. Arlene looked at Sharina, who had raised her eyebrows at the woman. Sharina said it was fine with her. A hand had been extended, and Arlene needed to act quickly before anyone changed their mind. Arlene looked at the woman. She was well dressed in a full-length skirt and silk head wrap. Her face was warm, with saddle brown skin that hewed darker around her cheekbones. She spoke tenderly and wasn't, quote, nasty, end quote, foul-smelling, or in tattered clothes. She did look young, and Arlene had overheard her say this would be her first apartment. But Arlene had also gleaned that the woman had come from a Tuesday Bible study. Maybe she wasn't the wild type. Arlene had so many questions, but it was either this option or a shelter. She only had to say, quote, thank you, end quote, and the stress that had been consuming her since Christmas would slide off. Quote, thank you, end quote, Arlene said. She smiled, and the stranger smiled. She hugged the stranger, letting out a small cry. This made the stranger cry. Arlene was so relieved and grateful that she hugged Sharina. Then she asked the stranger her name. Crystal Mayberry moved into 13th Street with only 3 garbage bags of clothes, no furniture, television, mattress, or microwave. Arlene didn't have much, but she had these things and suspected this was why Crystal had allowed her and the boys to stay. Arlene moved Jory and Jafar's into her bedroom. Crystal stored her things in the other bedroom and used it for privacy. But since she didn't have a bed, she slept on Arlene's love seat in the living room. Arlene wasn't planning on staying long, so Crystal didn't ask her to split the rent. Instead, when her check arrived, Arlene gave Crystal $150 and paid her phone and overdue electricity bill. She had enough left over to buy Jory a new pair of sneakers. That felt amazing. Crystal was 18, younger than Arlene's oldest son. She had been born prematurely on a spring day in 1990, shortly after her pregnant mother was stabbed 11 times in the back during a robbery. The attack had induced labor. Both mother and daughter survived. It was not the first time Crystal's mother had been stabbed. For as far back as she could remember, Crystal's father had beat her mother. He smoked crack, and so did her mother, and so did her mother's mother. Crystal was placed in foster care at age 5 and had bounced between dozens of homes. She lived with her Aunt Rhoda for 5 years. Then Aunt Rhoda returned her. After that, the longest Crystal lived anywhere was 8 months. When adolescence arrived, Crystal started getting into fights with other girls in the group homes. She picked up assault charges and a scar across the right cheek. People in their houses, pets, furniture, dishes, these came and went. Food was more stable, and Crystal began taking refuge in it. When Crystal was 16, she stopped going to high school. When she turned 17, her caseworker began transitioning her out of the system. By that time, she had passed through more than 25 foster placements. Crystal was barred temporarily from low-income housing owing to her assault charge, but her caseworker arranged for her to move into an apartment subsidized by a child welfare agency. To keep the apartment, Crystal had to find a job, but she was not the least bit interested in pulling half-day shifts at Quad Graphics or dropping onion rings at Burger King. She submitted a single application. Plus, having been approved for SSI on account of bipolar disorder, Crystal thought that her $750 a month check was more reliable than any job she could get. After 8 months, the caseworker told Crystal she would have to leave the apartment. Crystal stepped out of the foster care and into homelessness. She slept at shelters and on the street. She lived briefly with her grandmother, then a woman from her church, then a cousin. Arlene and Crystal met under peculiar circumstances, but they were engaging in a popular strategy poor people use to pay the bills and feed their children. Especially in the inner city, strangers brushed up against one another constantly, on the street, at job centers, in the welfare building, and found ways to ask for and offer help. Before she met Arlene, Crystal stayed a month with a woman who she had met on a bus. In the 1960s and 1970s, destitute families often relied on extended kin networks to get by. Poor black families were, quote, immersed in a domestic web of a large number of kin and friends whom they could count on, end quote, wrote the anthropologist Carol Stack in All Our Kin. Those entwined in such a web swapped goods and services on a daily basis. This did little to lift families out of poverty, but it was enough to keep them afloat. But large-scale social transformations, the crack epidemic, the rise of the black middle class, and the prison boom among them, had frayed the family safety net in poor communities. So as state politics like aid to families with dependent children that sought to limit, quote, kin dependence, end quote, by giving mothers who lived alone or with unrelated roommates a larger stipend than those who lived with relatives. The family was no longer a reliable source of support for poor people. Middle-class kin often did not know how to help or did not want to, and poor kin were often too poor or troubled or addicted to lend much of a hand. Legal entanglements got in the way too. This was why Crystal believed her Aunt Rhoda refused to open her door to her after she aged out of foster care. Rhoda had caught a case for her son. His dope found in her apartment and was serving 2 years on probation. This meant that law enforcement officers could inspect her apartment. Knowing this, Crystal asked if she could sleep outside on her porch. Rhoda said no. It was next to impossible for people to survive deep poverty on their own. If you cannot rely on your family, you could reach out to strangers, make disposable ties. But it was a lot to ask of someone you barely knew. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. So we've seen this act of kindness take place. I think that, and we've seen these different kinds of acts of kindness for other people take place throughout this book. People who know what it's like to be in the situation of vulnerability when it comes to needing a home and needing housing and reaching out their hand to try to help somebody who is in a similar situation. We've seen it in one of the stories of people of the trailer park. We've seen it with the Hinkstons, with the family was separated, then moving back into with one another once one of them got evicted. And now we see it here taking place as well with Crystal and Arlene. And it just, again, shows the capacity that we have as human beings to be empathetic and to be understanding, and how often that capacity is used, or often that capacity gets used when we see somebody in a situation which we can relate to. And I think that that's why we have to do the job of learning about these these issues, so that way, instead of needing experience for us to relate to them, we can have information that can help us relate to them. We can have knowledge that can help us relate to them. And so that's sort of what stands out from that section. Also, this concept of disposable ties in opposition to kin dependence is something that I think is also a very interesting concept. And again, a lot of this book just makes me harken back as well to the book that we read, which was entitled "Police, Citizens, and Power," and some of the interconnections that those things have as well. Let's continue reading. A week after Crystal moved in, Arlene sat at the kitchen table, circling apartment listings in the newspaper and Redbook, skipping the addresses that included, quote, background checks, end quote. Jafaris played with the caulk gun Quentin had left behind. Arlene's plan was to move by the first of the month. Quote, I don't want to live in the inner city ever again, end quote, she said. That first meeting with Crystal had felt like a blessing, so Arlene decided to be picky. What she would love was a 2-bedroom downtown apartment for under $525. When Jory walked in the door, Arlene straightened her back. He dragged his backpack into the kitchen with his head bowed, wearing his new shoes. Quote, you already know your teacher called me, end quote. Arlene's voice was sharp. Jory tried to explain himself, but Arlene cut him off. Quote, I don't want to hear it, because it's always a problem at every school you go to, end quote. Quote, nah, cause he stepped on my shoes. I turned around like, you done stepped on mine. And teacher gonna say, what you say? What you say? Everybody in that school, they say the teachers get slick with all the kids, end quote. Quote, I ain't trying to hear no excuses, end quote. Quote, because you believe nothing, end quote, Jory snapped back. Quote, that teacher already running on people. Even the teacher cuss at the kids, end quote. Quote, all that what you doing, you can stop it, end quote, Arlene yelled. Jory sniffed and tried to stop himself from crying. Arlene told him to start his homework, and he sulked back to their bedroom. Grabbing the newspaper, Arlene left to look for apartments, leaving her boys with Crystal. She headed to Teutonia Avenue, a main thoroughfare that cuts diagonally through Milwaukee's north side, and considered the snow. Arlene didn't remember seeing this much snow since she was a child. On Teutonia, she began calling on rent signs. Some landlords didn't answer. Others wanted more rent than she could give. Arlene found herself in the neighborhood where her brother Martin lived. She spotted rent signs but decided to move on. Quote, Martin think he can eat off us any dang minute, end quote, she thought. Earlier, Arlene had looked in the area where Gerger's father lived. She avoided that area too. Quote, those are just too close to him, end quote. Arlene was able to call on 9 units before she answered her phone and heard Crystal screaming. Quote, you got to get the fuck out of my house tonight. Tonight. Get your shit and go. Tonight, end quote. Arlene stayed on the phone a few more seconds, then hung up. Quote, this is too ridiculous, end quote, she said to herself. Crystal had said something about Jory being disrespectful, but Arlene sensed Crystal really was saying, I'm hungry. There was no food in the house, and Crystal had been complaining. Buying food was never part of the bargain, but Crystal was broke and her food stamps cut off. Quote, as long as we have food, she fine, end quote, Arlene thought. Quote, but when we don't, it's like this, end quote. Arlene stopped at a nearby corner store and ordered a $99 meat deal, an inner city staple consisting of 45 pounds of chicken wings and legs, pork chops, neck bones, salt pork, pig feet, turkey wings, bacon, and other cuts. The man behind the counter, speaking in Arabic on the phone, threw in 2 sacks of potatoes for free. Checking out, Arlene added soda and potato chips, paying in food stamps. She received $298 in stamps each month. She paid for a pack of Newport 100s with cash. When Arlene stepped back into the apartment, Jory immediately tried to explain his side of the story. Quote, she talking about putting Jafaris out with no coat on, no shoes, no nothing, end quote. Quote, Jafaris went outside on his own, end quote, Crystal snapped back. Quote, but Jory like, bitch, I'm going to punch you in your shit. Bitch, I'm going to do this. Bitch, I'm going to do that, end quote. Arlene listened silently as a mother does when she's come upon fighting children. Jory was saying that he tried to stick up for Jafaris after Crystal threatened to put him outside. Crystal was saying that Jory exploded after she playfully locked him out of the house. Quote, okay, end quote, Arlene said when she had heard enough. Quote, you ain't gonna do nothing to her, end quote, she told Jory. Then she turned to Crystal. Quote, and you're not gonna do anything to my child, end quote. When Jory tried to speak, Arlene snapped. Quote, and you can shut your mouth, end quote. Quote, she not telling you the whole story, end quote, Jory pleaded. Quote, why would you call her bitches, Jory, end quote, Arlene asked. Quote, she was calling me out my name, end quote. Quote, you know what, end quote, Crystal yelled. Quote, yeah, I'm a bitch. But remember, I'm that same bitch that opened up my door and let you stay here, even though I didn't know you from Adam and Eve. I was that same bitch that let you in. The landlord didn't care. She don't have to care, end quote. Quote, I don't know why you saying all this, because I know that, end quote, Arlene responded, her voice assertive and clear. She sent Jory out for the groceries. Crystal waved her phone in the air. Quote, whatever my mom says I should do, I'm going to do, because that's too much disrespect. Too much, end quote. Crystal was putting Arlene's fate in the hands of her, quote, spiritual mom, end quote, an older woman she met at a group home. She dialed the number, pressed the phone to her ear, and kept talking to Arlene. Quote, if he just called me one bitch, that would have been fine. I'd have just chopped it off. But to be called a bitch for an hour straight, end quote. No one picked up. Crystal redialed. Arlene walked to her room and began venting to the ceiling. Quote, she always complaining there ain't no food, but it ain't my responsibility to feed nobody but my kids. Nobody, end quote. Quote, I didn't ask you to buy shit for me, end quote, Crystal yelled back. Quote, because please believe it, please, because I'm going to have whatever I need, whatever. Whether I have to sell some ass, Crystal Sherella Sherrod Mayberry is going to get whatever she needs. Whatever, end quote. Arlene looked at her boys. Quote, I'm sick of y'all, end quote, she yelled. Quote, if I knew I'd have to be going through this, I would have left. What am I doing? I clean up. I just went and bought food for this house. What am I doing so wrong? End quote. Crystal dialed again. Still no answer. Now it was her turn to talk to the ceiling. She began praying out loud. Quote, God, I need an answer right now. God, please. I need to hear something from my mama, my bishop. God, I promise you. I wish I would have let me learn to love the way I love. I wish you wouldn't have let me learn to love the way I love. I wish I would have been bitter for all the terrible things that happened in my life. Whoa, Lord, end quote. Crystal began singing a hymn. She walked around the apartment, humming and breathing in through her nose. Occasionally, she would pause and close her eyes. She was calming herself down. Arlene looked at Jory. Quote, you disrespecting, and she tell us, you gotta go. Where's we going? End quote. Quote, end quote, Jory started. Quote, I said, where is we going? End quote. Jory went quiet and began to cry. Arlene had spent down her check and didn't know where she would take her boys if Crystal tossed them out. She looked at Jafaris, who during the fight had distracted himself by drawing in a notebook. 2 monsters in hats and shoes, one big, the other small. Quote, you know what? End quote, Crystal finally said. Her eyes were brimming with tears, and she was not yelling, but purring in a new voice, hushed and soothing. Quote, let me say something. Ooh, God, I wish you would have never gave me the spirit of love. My feelings are hurt from both of y'all, but I can't put y'all out, 'cause, like I told you, I'm filled with the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Ghost telling me not to make y'all leave, end quote. Quote, filled with the Holy Ghost, but does more cussing than a little bit, end quote, Arlene mumbled under her breath. To Arlene, it wasn't the Holy Ghost, but the meat cuts and potato chips and love seat that had delivered the message. In the heat of the fight, she had made sure to tell Crystal, quote, I'm not leaving without taking my stuff out of here, end quote. Jory sat on his mattress in the bedroom. He felt dejected, and Arlene knew it. Later on, after things were resolved, Arlene sat down next to Jory and tried to explain herself. Quote, What kind of parent am I to just listen to her and not listen to you? End quote. She said softly. Quote, but this is what comes when you lose your house. This is what comes. End quote. And that brings us to the end of chapter 12 and to the beginning of chapter 13, which is entitled E24. So let's have a short reflection. So what stands out to me from the entirety of this chapter is the word poverty, and how and what the unique experience is for people who are living in poverty, and how poverty how financial poverty has it's a war of attrition when you're in the depths of poverty. It it humbles you regularly. uh it can destroy your confidence. It makes you compromise on things you would prefer to not compromise on. It leaves you, at times it makes you have to be passive about things you would rather be assertive about, all because you are just trying to survive another day or survive another hour. And you're in situations which they're not ideal or opportune situations, but you are in the situations nonetheless. And you're just trying to do what you got to do to get through another day in a situation, with the hopes that at some point you can work yourself or get yourself into a situation that is less poverty constricted or less poverty confined. And I've spent the majority of my adult life in different degrees of poverty, and I think that that's one of the things that's very interesting when you look at what the poverty line is, how much money you have to make to not be in poverty. One of the things we've realized as we go through and read in here is that, reading this book Evicted, is that just how much it costs to just live, the living expenses is something that is very extreme and very uh, taxing. And so, as somebody who has been in situations dealing with poverty, somebody who has been in an apartment and been evicted from an apartment, somebody who's been looking for an apartment after being evicted, been looking for a place after being evicted, of a person who's had to go and stay with friends, or a person who has had to go and move back into their parents' household, I understand the psychological battle, that the psychological war of attrition that exists when you are in the depths of poverty, when you don't have a lot of money. And I think that one of the things it can also do is it damages your perception of yourself, because so much of our lives are so much when we are growing up, we're taught to value ourselves by how much money we have, or by how good of a job you'll have and how much money you'll make from that job. That's, tends to be how the term good job very rarely has to do with the things that your job does for the community and for the world, and it has directly to do with how much money that you make. And and so I just, as I'm going through and reading this chapter, that's what stuck out to me, is that this is a family, these are people who are in the thralls of poverty, and being in the thralls of poverty invokes all of these other triggers and these other traumas, and it makes it so that people are more irritable and people are more frustrated and angry. And one of the things that Arlene talked about was that she felt this was happening because Crystal didn't have any food in the house and didn't have anything to eat. And that's a real thing. You know how many people get upset because they don't have food and they haven't ate, and they're or upset because they haven't got enough to sleep, because they can't sleep, they don't have a bed to sleep in, or all of these different things that uh, the world has an abundance of. There's an abundance of homes, an abundance of food, an abundance of water. There's an abundance of resources, but these resources are hoarded by the people who have the most of the resources, and who only want to relinquish those resources if they are getting a financial incentive back. And so let's end this episode. We will be back tomorrow with another episode of Evicted as we start chapter 13. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. I'll let you tomorrow.